Back to the studio here, where we are entering the last few hours of this third edition. But last but not least, as we say, that is to say, we still have great sessions, great pitches of projects, and great networking to do in the next few hours that remain, plus a very important moment, a moment that many are waiting for, which is the closing ceremony at 4 p.m., during which we will announce the 10 projects that will be the laureates of this year for support, that will be slated for support by the SCUP in our jargon. That means the Scale-Up Committee, the support system that the Paris Peace Forum has been running since 2018. We already have 2 years of projects. As you know, we select 10 projects from the 100 that have been presented. They are not necessarily the 10 best. We don't necessarily select them because it's not a beauty pageant, in other words. Rather, it's the projects that we think have a lot of potential and projects for which we think we can make a difference with the SCUP. That is to say, we can push them forward, we can help them replicate elsewhere, we can help them scale up, that is to say, grow and reach a sufficient size, etc. So Trisha and myself will be presenting this closing ceremony at 4 p.m. and we will announce which projects have been selected for this. In the meantime, we have a couple of really interesting sessions. Let me just mention a few. At 2:30 p.m. Paris time, on the main stage, we'll have EU Commissioner Thierry Breton speaking on the governance framework for the data economy, along with Ajay Banga, who's not only the CEO of MasterCard, but also the CEO of the International Chamber of Commerce, which, as you know, is an international organization, along with our Chinese colleague, Mabel Miao. She is at the Center for China and Globalization and has been accompanying the forum for the past 2 years. So this should be fascinating. What global governance for the data economy? At 3 p.m. on stage C, we'll have a debate that has been organized by the Körber Stiftung. And the Körber Stiftung is one of the founding members, I would say one of the first founding members of the Paris Peace Forum as early as January 2018, 8 months before the forum first edition started. And the Körber Stiftung has organized this discussion with French Minister Clément Beaune for European Affairs, as well as many others. It will be presented by Nora Müller, who is also serving here in the governance of the association. At 3 p.m. then on stage A, may I do a quick plug for a project that you may know is dear to my heart. It's the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace that was launched here at the Paris Peace Forum in 2018 on November 12, and which gathers now more than 1,100 supporters that have banded around these norms for cybersecurity. And we know how important cybersecurity is now that our lives have moved online with the pandemic. And so we'll have a sort of new impetus for the Paris Call, both gathering the community and also trying to converge with the process that is going on at the UN with 2 chairs from the UN, Ambassadors Lauber and Patriota. And representing the Paris Call will be one government, Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French Minister for European and Foreign Affairs, as well as Brad Smith, the President of Microsoft. One last quick word. A bit earlier, we'll have a session on the governance of outer space. That might seem a bit remote, but believe me, given the recent developments in space, we need to have a more regulated and a better organized outer space, because it's also part of our common humanity. Now, I will leave you for lunch for those who are on Paris time, or for breakfast for those who are waking up in the US and elsewhere in the West. And we'll insist on the fact that we still have a very rich afternoon of sessions that will be concluded by the closing ceremony, during which we'll announce the 10 projects that will be the laureates for this year. Stay tuned.
Bonjour, bienvenue. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this planet. I'm Pascal Lamy. I'm the chair of the Paris Forum, but I happen to be the moderator of this session, which is devoted to global supply chains. Global supply chains for a very long time were a pretty boring topic for experts, trade wonks, and a few economists. COVID suddenly has projected these global supply chains into the public debate, into the public discourse. Politicians have suddenly, because of COVID, started talking about these global chains, whether they were good, whether they were bad, and why was it so? Because they are the net that connects production systems in many places of this planet, whether goods and services, and during the COVID crisis, some of these chains broke down, thus revealing fragilities in capacity of countries, people, consumers, to source goods or even services which they need. So this is the topic of this panel. I want to welcome its participants, starting with the French Trade Minister. Welcome, Minister. Then we, of course, have a businessman who knows what sourcing and supply chain is about, Laxman Narasimhan, who's the CEO of Reckitt Benckiser, which is a big multinational selling hygiene and health products. We have, as we can see now, Marion Jansen, who is the head of the trade division of the OECD, and I happen to have worked in the past with Marion Jansen many times. She's a formidable expert of trade. And we now have, which I do not see on my screen, but which I hope will join very soon, Vera Songwe, who is the boss of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, also an old friend of mine, and I like to have gender-balanced panel, so I hope Vera will join us very soon, not just for this reason. So starting with Minister Ritzler, and I will then give the floor to Laxman. Minister, what is the French and the European reaction? I can see a French flag behind you. I can see a European flag behind you. What is the French and the European reaction, analysis of this problem? Fragility, sustainability of supply chains as they have appeared during COVID, and do you think the international trading system is able to cope with that?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup. C'est évidemment un sujet majeur de réflexion, car, comme vous l'avez très bien dit, la crise a démontré, si je puis dire, qu'il y avait une fragilité sur un certain nombre de chaînes de valeur, avec un manque clairement de résilience. Alors c'est un des aspects qui est aujourd'hui très présent au regard de nos compatriotes, au regard des Européens, comme d'autres, en matière par exemple d'accroissement des inégalités ou en matière d'impact des échanges sur l'environnement. Et donc nous avons besoin c'est très clair, de pouvoir redonner confiance dans l'ouverture aux échanges. Nous devons donner confiance dans le libre-échange. Et pour ça, nous devons redonner du sens. Nous devons faire en sorte que les différentes politiques qui sont conduites soient plus efficaces au service, notamment, des chaînes de valeur. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, on voit la fragilité de celle-ci. Alors, il y a plusieurs leviers pour agir. Il y a bien sûr d'abord le levier industriel. C'est un sujet que je suis moins directement, que suit plus directement mes homologues qui sont au ministère de l'économie, des finances et de la relance, mais il y a aussi une dimension commerciale. Nous devons collectivement repenser, et c'est tout le travail que nous faisons en Europe dans le cadre de l'autonomie stratégique ouverte et durable, de diversifier nos fournisseurs, diversifier nos approvisionnements, pour permettre qu'on ne s'approvisionne pas simplement dans un pays qui, pour X raisons, pourrait se voir fermé à tout échange, par exemple lié à une crise sanitaire. Nous devons penser peut-être à constituer des stocks stratégiques. Et en l'occurrence, nous avons là aussi une réflexion à conduire pour comprendre comment, sur quels produits en particulier, comment constituer ces stocks stratégiques. Et puis, il y a bien évidemment aussi tout ce qui permet de relocaliser une partie de ces chaînes de valeur, soit dans notre pays, soit dans l'Union européenne, soit à proximité de l'Union européenne, dans ce qu'on appelle une colocalisation, c'est-à-dire une complémentarité des chaînes de valeur pour les rendre moins fragiles. Et c'est donc tout le travail que nous avons conduit et que nous conduisons notamment aussi dans ce travail autour du développement durable, parce que finalement, il faut que ces chaînes de valeur soient résilientes dans le temps long, et c'est un travail que nous opérons, que ce soit au niveau de l'Union européenne elle-même, avec la mise en place d'un mécanisme d'ajustement carbone aux frontières qui peut contribuer à mieux lutter contre les fuites de carbone, tout en faisant que ces chaînes de valeur soient plus résilientes. C'est ce que nous pouvons faire, par exemple, avec la législation actuellement sur la déforestation, pour mieux lutter contre la déforestation importée. C'est le travail que nous pouvons conduire aussi dans le cadre des accords de libre-échange entre l'Union européenne et des partenaires, par exemple un pays ou une région. Et c'est ce que nous faisons en demandant à ce que dans tout nouvel accord, l'accord de Paris soit une clause essentielle. Nous pensons que c'est un moyen de rendre plus résilientes ces chaînes de valeur. Et puis, bien sûr, il y a tout le travail au sein de l'OMC qui doit être refondé en profondeur pour permettre un cadre équitable au niveau international pour que ces chaînes de valeur soient plus résilientes, soient sécurisées. Parce que s'il y a une concurrence qui n'est pas équitable, à ce moment-là, ça fragilise aussi les chaînes de valeur. Voilà un peu cher Pascal Lamy, les différents axes sur lesquels nous travaillons actuellement autour de ces questions de chaîne de valeur.
Thanks very much, Minister. So, you want them to be safer, more resilient, more secure, but you also want them to be more sustainable, which is a sort of less physical and more political approach to supply chains. Let's now hear from Laxman Narasimhan, who is in a global company, a multinational, a plugged into supply chains operation. Let's hear the view of somebody who has to run supply chains about this concept of both physical security, safety, resilience, and sustainability, which is a bit of another side of the equation. Laxman, over to you.
Well, thank you, Pascal. Thank you for having me on this panel. I do agree with the minister on his perspectives. You know, there is no doubt that COVID-19 brought about an unimaginable supply chain challenge to governments, to institutions, and to companies alike, as the world looked to secure essential personal protection products, health products, sanitation products during COVID-19. The crisis was a result of an unprecedented sense of events, which has tested governments, institutions, and companies by just the sheer scale of what has been happening, as well as the simultaneous nature of the virus's rapid spread. Every supply chain was left exposed. In the case of my own company, we simply could not imagine that one product, which had sourcing across 3 countries, China, Italy, and France, would all be forced to stop production at the same time. Multiple countries were in lockdown, something we had never quite imagined, although it was possible, but perhaps we hadn't planned adequately for. And we were not alone, even if we only have a small role to play in this overall system. So we've addressed our supply chain challenges in 3 phases. China gave us great learnings, our business there. Initially, our focus was on recovery, how to ensure that our people were safe and that we had essential products available to keep our operations running. In some countries, we found it increasingly difficult to move between regions, with local lockdowns preventing the flow of goods from one state to another. But second, once we realized the demand for critical products outweighed the available supply, we sought ways to increase capacities of contract manufacturers and radically simplifying what we made in terms of our product range. We've increased capacity for some products 5 times and others up to 20 times by investing in capacity and partnering with suppliers. Our company is agile, our company is flexible, but even this really tested us. Finally, we realized we needed to rethink end-to-end our supply chains to build greater resilience. Our focus moved from configuring a supply chain which was based on business performance, lowest cost, highest quality, highest service, to one which balances 3 equally important considerations: better for the environment, a better social compact, as well as better business performance, all the while being more flexible and being more resilient to deal with consumer shifts and future shocks. This is very important because a recent McKinsey Global Institute study identified that disruptions like what we have seen with COVID will become more common. They say once every 3.7 years, we can expect to see a significant supply chain incident, which could last about a month. And the most severe will take a big financial toll. We also know from this crisis that the digital transformation is accelerating even more. Now, people point fingers at globalization as being the culprit, but perhaps not enough at other decisions, including, for example, what is the right amount of sufficient safety stock that one should have, and where should it be, and when is it more needed? Technology is altering some of the production functions. And when I therefore think about globalization, there have been concerns about growing inequality, the erosion of national sovereignty for many years. COVID has just exacerbated these concerns. However, let's not forget that globalization has helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And what is clear is that globalization requires a stronger safety net. And without a safety net, be it in job creation, skill building, wage fairness, and diversity, it leaves fractures that are open and that need to be addressed. And this is the globalization paradox. The issues identified as those caused by globalization are often best solved by deeper global cooperation and openness. It is remarkable to observe the pace at which science, knowledge, and technology from around the world is coming together to address this virus problem. We can see development finance across borders coming in to help address the issues of climate change. Therefore, globalization can and must exist, and systems need to be designed for that. After all, no one country can or should be the factory for the world. What is required is joined-up solutions that are multilateral, multi-sector, particularly around public health. And from a private sector perspective, we know we have a role to play. But we need to work across the private sector, the public sector, the social sector. We cannot do it any other way.
Thanks, Axman. So, rethinking, getting ready, rethinking the supply chain as necessary is absolutely what is needed. And what you're telling us is that this is the way to go now. The sort of enlarged corporate social responsibility for both safety, security, and sustainability. I think the message is pretty clear. And of course, I like this notion that this can only be done with deeper cooperation between public entities, private entities, NGOs, solid academic institutions, which is now the good occasion to turn to Mario Jansen. Mario, you've witnessed, watched, discussed this model of globalization via supply chain. At the WTO, ILO, International Trade Center, so you've had many angles. You now are one of the world experts of trade at the position of the OECD. What's the deep view from your side on where we come from, where we are, and where we are going on supply chain? Over to you, Mario.
Thank you, Pascal, and thank you for having me with you today. I would maybe like to start my intervention by picking up a word that the previous speaker used, collaboration. We have at OECD, of course, also observed what happened to supply chains during the crisis, and we have been advising our members on how to handle this situation. And in this work, we have been reaching out to business representatives through the consultative group of BIAC, and we have been trying to find out how they are handling the situation and what they are expecting policymakers to do. When it comes to how they handled the situation, the stories were very similar to the one that we heard before. A lot of challenges, difficulties, but a relatively rapid putting in place of contingency plans. When it comes to what they expect from policymakers, we heard the words more collaboration, more coherence, more cooperation, more cause, not less. And this is very much the case because lack of collaboration around issues like border policies, lack of collaboration around issues like regulations or standards that we would like global value chains to meet, creates costs for business and makes it difficult to do business across borders. When you think of an issue like, does an essential product, let's think of the famous mask that was so important during the crisis, does it meet the safety standards, the health standards that we would like it to meet during a crisis? In order for a mask to travel from one place to the other, it has to meet normally the standard of the receiving country. Now, the first issue is, does that standard correspond to the standard in the exporting country or not? If it doesn't, then the producer needs to know about the foreign standard, needs to know and needs to meet that standard. A lot of costs occur from the fact that the producer doesn't know what he or she has to do. That's a particular high cost for small and medium-sized enterprises. But then when you know you have to pay for meeting that standard, then you have to prove that you meet the standard. That's a part of the process that we call certification. That process is also costly and also often opaque for exporters. The smaller the exporter, the more costly, the more difficult it is to deal with this aspect of meeting a regulation or a standard. So one of the things policymakers can focus on is first create as much transparency as they can around regulations, making the information costs as low as possible, and second, making all the costs around certification recognitions as low as possible. This can be done by cooperating on the certification systems. In an ideal case, you also cooperate and converge in your standards. You have the same standards across countries. That's often the most difficult part, but that would be the one that reduces costs most. These unnecessary costs that I mentioned, the ones around information and certification, we have calculated at the OECD that by eliminating those costs, we could increase trade by 5.5% for OECD members. So that's an important amount, and that's by reducing a cost that is not very necessary in order to protect customers. It's a cost that you can reduce by collaborating and cooperating. I want to end this part of my intervention by referring to a very different type of collaboration around trade that currently may become increasingly important. Business has been telling us that they're very concerned about the different types of border restriction for travelers. This is a huge problem for certain sectors like tourism, but it is increasingly also becoming a problem for other businesses, for businesses that trade in goods, for instance. At some stage, you will need to meet a customer, to negotiate a contract, for instance, to discuss the details of a contract, or you have to go and see a customer to repair a machine. Currently, there is a lot of opacity around what happens at the borders for travelers. There is a lot of discrepancy across countries and regular changes. There, a lot can be done through collaboration and more information to reduce costs for businesses. And that's what business seems to be asking.
Thanks, Marion, for bringing into the conversation this issue of standardization, which was, in a way, a bit in what we heard from Laxman, and this notion that if the sustainability of global supply chain matters, notably in areas like safety, security, environment, or even social inclusion, we need a sort of as common as possible matrix of measuring, certifying whether or not these supply chains fit with this sort of criteria. And maybe I can now ask back to Lachman while waiting for having the French minister live. I understand I can have him in audio, but not in camera for the moment. What's your reaction to Marion's point, Laxman, that there is a need for a public-private partnership and that private operators would, that's what she said, welcome a bit more of international cooperation, convergence on criteria about the sustainability of these supply chains?
I couldn't agree more with this, because I think part of our challenge is that when you start looking at what you need to do, you also need to understand how you can conform to the various regulations that do exist. But also, as you start designing things, you've got to take into account what is it that your consumers want and what is it that your customers want. One of the things I know that as being in a privileged position of saying that we're a maker of trusted brands for nearly 200 years, we're privileged to know what it takes to earn the trust of consumers every single day. Consumers want transparency. They want transparency in what's in their products. They want transparency in where you source your materials. They want transparency in how you treat your workers and, whether you treat them fairly or not. Our company comes from this sort of a heritage where our founder, Sir James Beckett, built a model village for his employees in the north of England and supported education and awareness for all our local communities. And so in this sort of a context where we know that this is very important, that you have to be open and transparent, it does become helpful if we have interoperable systems, that we are able to operate within a framework of how global supply chains work. And I think that is something that would be incredibly helpful for companies like ours who are operating in various jurisdictions across various countries.
So thank you very much. So this leads already at this stage to a sort of operational conclusion of our discussion, which is that increasing the sustainability, the safety, the resilience of supply chains needs some sort of public system that allows to measure properly this convergence. I understand Minister Riester is only on audio, and that's it. If you're still with us, Minister, which is more difficult for me to assess than having your picture on my screen, I'd like you to go back to what you said about the fact that reshoring, shortening reallocating the geographical distribution of these supply chains is something your country and the European Union is working on. Can you tell us a bit more about this and how you intend to do that, the benefits and the costs that this entails? Over to you, Minister.
Merci. Écoutez, désolé pour la vidéo, mais il y a manifestement un problème technique. Mais oui, nous sommes absolument mobilisés tant au niveau de l'Union européenne dans le cadre du travail sur l'autonomie stratégique ouverte et durable qu'au niveau de la France, notamment dans le cadre du plan de relance, puisque un certain nombre de travaux sont engagés dans le cadre du plan de relance pour venir accompagner ce travail des entreprises dans la réorganisation de leur chaîne de valeur. Alors ça passe par évidemment un niveau industriel, dans le cadre d'une stratégie industrielle, mais ça passe aussi par la revue de notre politique commerciale au niveau de l'Union européenne. Nous sommes en train de mener ce travail pour repenser notre politique commerciale, pour que les outils de la politique commerciale soient aussi au service d'une meilleure résilience de ces chaînes de valeur, à travers ce que je rappelais tout à l'heure, un certain nombre de mécanismes comme le mécanisme d'ajustement carbone aux frontières qui permet de remonter les standards de production de tous partout dans le monde, on en est convaincu, ce qui permet d'assurer une meilleure résilience de ces chaînes de valeur, en demandant à ce qu'un certain nombre de contributions à des enjeux qui dépassent les questions économiques et commerciales soient prises en compte. Je pense par exemple à l'accord de Paris sur le climat, je pense à un certain nombre de conventions de l'OIT. Bref, tout ça, tout ce qui permet, encore une fois, de rendre ces chaînes de valeur plus résilientes. Et puis, il y a le travail que nous devons conduire, qui a déjà commencé, en lien avec les entreprises, parce qu'il ne faut évidemment ne pas oublier que c'est d'abord et avant tout les entreprises qui font ce travail-là. Nous sommes là pour accompagner, pour mettre des moyens, pour peut-être bâtir des législations, mais c'est d'abord les entreprises qui doivent faire ce travail-là. C'était très bien rappelé d'ailleurs tout à l'heure. Nous faisons ce travail-là avec des partenaires en marge de l'Union européenne. Je me suis rendu au Maroc, par exemple, très récemment, pour voir avec nos partenaires marocains comment on pouvait réfléchir à une relocalisation d'une partie des chaînes de valeur en Europe, mais aussi, par exemple, sur l'automobile ou, par exemple, dans l'aéronautique, dans le Maghreb, pour une meilleure complémentarité. Parce qu'on sait bien que la proximité, la régionalisation finalement de ces chaînes de valeur est nature à sécuriser ces chaînes de valeur. Et pour autant, il faut en parallèle assurer un cadre de concurrence équitable. Parce que plus on est dans une régionalisation de ces chaînes de valeur, plus on est intégré finalement dans ces chaînes de valeur, plus on a besoin absolument d'avoir un cadre de relations commerciales équitable. C'est bien sûr l'exemple le plus flagrant, c'est l'Union européenne qui n'a pas de barrière douanière, qui n'a pas de quotas, pas de tarifs, pas de quotas, mais qui est donc très intégrée en termes commerciaux, mais qui nécessite absolument et qui a mis en place des dispositifs pour veiller à ce que les pratiques soient loyales entre acteurs des différentes chaînes de valeur. Et c'est la réflexion que nous avons actuellement dans le cadre des négociations du Brexit avec nos amis britanniques pour s'assurer qu'à nos portes, on n'ait pas, certes, une proximité de chaînes de valeur ou une relocalisation d'une partie des chaînes de valeur, mais dans le cadre d'une concurrence qui ne serait pas une concurrence loyale. Donc nous devons absolument, si jamais il y a un accord très intégré avec les Britanniques demain en matière commerciale, de s'assurer de garantir les règles d'une concurrence équitable, le fameux level playing field par exemple. Donc voilà les différents aspects sur lesquels nous travaillons et d'une façon très opérationnelle, d'un côté au niveau du ministère de l'économie et des finances et de la relance, ici au ministère de l'Europe et des Affaires étrangères, en lien interministériel et en lien bien évidemment avec nos partenaires européens et les partenaires essentiels des pouvoirs publics que sont les premiers acteurs de cette relocalisation des chaînes de valeur que sont les entreprises.
Thanks, Minister. So let's let's leave Brexit aside for a moment. You still have a few days to work on this tough issue and hopefully make it work, because this is a typical example of de-regionalization, I may say. But you floated this concept of a sort of regionalization, to some extent, regional reshoring of supply chains. And I will now ask both Marion Jansen and Lakshman Narasimhan, what's their sense, what's their reaction to this notion that the way to go, which is what the French minister says, and what we hear from the European Union under this concept of strategic autonomy, which sometimes is strategic autonomy tout court, but sometimes open strategic autonomy. So, Marion and Lakshman, both in your own remits and realms of responsibilities, do you like this concept of regionalization of supply chains? Is this the way to go? Marion first, and then Lakshman. Over to you, Marion.
I think I would like to make 2 points on this. First is I think that policymakers have to be aware of the complexity behind this idea of reshoring supply chains. Complexity because what is an optimal way of organizing the maximum resilience, let's say, of a chain will depend on each chain. Each chain will be different. It's for some chains you will be able to apply storage methods, for others you won't. For some chains you will be able to source everything in a region or country. For others it's simply impossible because you need a raw material that is elsewhere. The deep knowledge of what is needed for a chain sits in the private sector, and the private sector has the experience to manage those chains. So if any thinking in this direction should, in my view, in our view, I think I could say at OECD, should imply a collaboration with the private sector and using that knowledge rather than reinventing the wheel. A fully public engineering of a supply chain is something that may be very difficult, is in our view very difficult to achieve and will be very, very inefficient. Now, when it comes to the reshoring as a policy objective, if you would like to reshore in order to be less exposed to shocks, in order to be able to have full control of managing those shocks, then you may think that by giving up a bit of efficiency, by reshoring, I get bigger control of managing shocks. Well, our research has shown that that's not necessarily the case. By reshoring, you would then start to be fully exposed to your own shocks and will not be able to buffer those off. So many countries will become more volatile, will become more vulnerable, and will experience fluctuations of their production, of their access to certain consumption goods. That said, it will very much depend on how large your market is. If you are China or the United States, it's easier to consider producing a lot of things in your country than if you are Morocco. And for Morocco, things may be different if they are part of an African free continental trade area or if they are Morocco alone. For smaller countries, the reshoring debate is, in our view, a very risky debate. And the regionalization debate very much depends on the setup of the regional structures. So 2 messages: value chain operations require collaboration with the private sector, an exchange of information at the very least, and by reshoring or shortening supply chains, countries will not necessarily be exposed to less fluctuations. This needs to be very carefully assessed. The opposite may be the case.
Thanks, Mario, for this balanced and very diplomatic way of saying that, of course, there is a sort of efficiency versus security equation to solve. If these supply chains have proliferated, it's because they were cheaper than more centralized systems of production and sourcing. On the other side, the experience has shown, and that was true even before COVID, in circumstances like Fukushima, for instance, that this efficiency could lead to some fragility. So cheaper on the one side, but maybe less resilient or secure, and reshoring, which might make them more safe, will be more expensive. So, Laxman, from where you are, how do you deal with this equation? You are sourcing what you sell in your company from all over the place. Do you have this efficiency versus security equation in your mind? Yes, maybe no. And if yes, how do you deal with it?
Well, firstly, I think the perspective on this is very sector specific. I think if I look at our sector, a lot of what we make is sold in the regions in which it is made. So I think it's a little less of a concern in that sense. Now, having said that, you do have raw materials that are only available in certain parts of the world. You take a look at the latex raw material. It's only grown in certain parts of the world rather than, or it's only sourced in certain parts of the world than it's available everywhere. So one has to be conscious of all that. I think if I think a little bit about what is it that we spend our time on, what we are really spending on time on is how do we ensure that our supply chains are both, that they fulfill the business performance goals, but also balance other two factors, which is the point about the environmental sustainability of it, as well as the social sustainability of it. If I look at the purpose of our company is about the relentless pursuit of a cleaner and healthier world. Now we know, and I think we've had several conversations yesterday, I think at the forum as well, about the fact there is this intersection of planetary health, animal health, and human health. And it's these ecosystems that are fundamentally connected. And these damaged ecosystems, create these interdependencies that, the pandemic is clearly showcasing. And we see it in our business, which covers health, hygiene, and nutrition. So we have to really understand these interdependencies. And we need to realize that the resilience of our value chains also revolves around its social sustainability. Whether we are talking about the livelihoods of small farmers, the treatment of migrant workers, the creation of jobs, the providing the opportunities to upgrade skills, the avoidance of modern slavery, fair remuneration for work, or embracing diversity and inclusion throughout our value chain. I mean, these are core social imperatives that we have. And delivering on all of these enables our value chains to be sustainable over time. So it isn't just the location of it, but it's also the way we actually do this. They enable the communities in which we operate. And if they thrive, and so do we as a society. So this is an important consideration. I think we have to look at it from a sustainability standpoint, but sustainability is all-encompassing. It isn't just focused on one particular thing. And I do agree with the OECD view that one has to be thoughtful about how one does this to ensure that we are sustainable on multiple dimensions rather than just sustainable in one dimension.
So that's a very clear and sophisticated answer. Basically, the equation is not a simple equation between cost of production on the one side and security of supply chains on the other side. It's a much wider picture where environment, tracking, the supply chain, the conditions under which goods or services are produced, environment-wise, society-wise, also matter, which I believe you're right to say, Laxman, is a growing trend in business. So in many ways, this debate on supply chains gets to the wider debate on the sort of sustainability of our production systems. Now, if I may go back to Minister Riester, you mentioned, Minister, that France was pushing within the European Union for taking into account more environmental sustainability, more social sustainability criteria in its trade policy, including in the way it runs its trade agreements. And I just published, that's another story, with Europe Jacques Delors, which is one of the three Institute Jacques Delors, a piece on this, which was published this week on how to green EU trade agreements. End of this little commercial on my side. Minister Riester, how do you think an Indian company or a Chinese company or an African company will react at the notion that the European Union is going to submit its trade policy to much more environmental or social sustainability criteria conditions? This is what I understand is your position, and it seems to be growingly the EU position. How do you make sure that this way to look at trade does not lead to new forms of protectionism? And I put this question very openly in order to avoid that it's put too clearly on the table by Mario Janssen. So, as if the OECD was asking to the French Republic, how do you make sure what you say does not result in protectionism? Over to you, Minister.
Non, mais c'est bien d'être très clair. Le point, c'est que nous sommes absolument convaincus que la meilleure, l'action, l'échelle d'action la plus pertinente pour traiter de ces questions-là est l'échelle multilatérale, l'échelle globale. Parce qu'en matière de développement durable, ce sont d'ailleurs des enjeux globaux. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle nous sommes absolument mobilisés sur la réforme de l'OMC. C'est pour ça que nous sommes absolument mobilisés pour qu'il y ait bientôt la nomination d'une nouvelle directrice générale, ou un directeur général, en l'occurrence une directrice générale de l'OMC, avec poids politique, la force pour pouvoir réformer l'OMC, et que dans ces cadres multilatéraux, la dimension développement durable, dans ses différents aspects, puisse être mieux prise en compte. Finalement, c'est l'intérêt global de tous de pouvoir avoir une planète qui soit davantage protégée et des chaînes de valeur plus résilientes parce que plus durables. Et donc, je pense qu'on peut convaincre, à partir du moment où les réformes de l'OMC permettent que les négociations sur ces questions globales puissent être davantage menées à leur terme. Je pense par exemple à la négociation actuellement sur la pêche, qui est une négociation importante et qui, je l'espère, va aboutir. Nous avons besoin de réformer l'OMC pour que ces négociations aboutissent, pour qu'il y ait davantage de vérification de la bonne application des engagements pris dans ces négociations. Or, aujourd'hui, on voit bien que cette dimension-là n'est pas suffisamment prise en compte. J'en profite pour dire qu'au niveau de l'Union européenne, on muscle notre jeu, si je puis dire, en la matière, puisque maintenant nous avons un procureur commercial qui a la charge, justement, avec ses équipes, de s'assurer que tous les engagements de nos partenaires dans le cadre de nos accords de libre-échange soient bien respectés. Et puis, nous avons besoin d'avoir un système de règlement des différends qui permette de pointer avec force et éventuellement sanctionner les acteurs dans le cadre de ces échanges globaux qui ne respecteraient pas leurs engagements et qui, par exemple, pratiqueraient du dumping environnemental ou ne respecteraient pas les mêmes normes, la même ambition en termes de normes environnementales. Et donc, même si nous sommes convaincus qu'il faut balayer devant notre porte, qu'il faut d'abord que dans les accords bilatéraux régionaux que nous signons, nous soyons exigeants en la matière, nous pensons en même temps qu'il est très important d'agir au niveau global et donc au niveau multilatéral, qui est pour nous, encore une fois, la meilleure échelle d'action. Je l'ai dit parce qu'il y a des problèmes globaux qui doivent avoir une réponse globale, et puis parce qu'il y a aussi une question d'acceptabilité par les peuples des contraintes. Vous parliez des entreprises chinoises, indiennes. Pour que cette acceptabilité soit non pas perçue comme un oukase de l'Union européenne qui voudrait imposer des choses au reste du monde, c'est que justement cette ambition, cette exigence soit une exigence globale, multilatérale, pour qu'elle puisse être le mieux possible acceptée par les peuples et acceptée par les différents acteurs, notamment les acteurs économiques.
Thanks, Minister. So, a stronger strategic autonomy for Europe, but within a multilateral framework, which implies a reform of the World Trade Organization, and I think I 100% agree with that. Now, let's look at a few questions that are coming from our participants. This formidable platform allows for questions coming from all over the place. And I take the first one that appears in my chat question box, which is speaking about WTO reform. And I think this is a question for you, Minister. Speaking about WTO reform, do you believe that a new president in the United States of America is a good omen for reopening a negotiation on WTO reform? Minister, is that your view?
Oui, c'est mon opinion. Je crois que les premières déclarations de Joe Biden sont positives dans ce sens-là, et donc c'est un signal très positif, le fait qu'il souhaite réintégrer l'accord de Paris, qui est un accord global, le fait qu'il souhaite réinvestir les institutions multilatérales, et donc j'en conclus qu'une des institutions en question est l'OMC. Donc je crois que c'est important parce qu'on ne peut pas réformer l'OMC sans que les États-Unis reviennent pleinement dans les discussions, dans les négociations, dans l'action multilatérale, avec un certain nombre, bien sûr, d'exigences qu'on connaît déjà et qui sont des exigences qui, pour certaines, sont absolument pertinentes. Mais nous avons besoin de faire en sorte qu'on puisse avec eux, dans le cadre, notamment nous, on y travaille dans le cadre d'une nouvelle relation transatlantique, et que nous puissions donner un nouveau souffle à l'OMC. Je pense que la nouvelle directrice générale, si le consensus qui est en cours conduit jusqu'à ce que ce soit le docteur Ngozi, sera de nature à conforter ce travail de renouvellement de l'OMC. Et c'est vrai que les premières paroles de Joe Biden nous incitent à l'optimisme lucide, l'optimisme raisonnable, parce qu'on attend de voir exactement ce que ça voudra dire concrètement. Et je pense que c'est essentiel de remettre les États-Unis au cœur des discussions multilatérales.
Thank you, Minister. I have another question which I think I will direct to Marion Jansen. How to make sure that criteria for assessing the sustainability of supply chains are shared by everybody? What's your answer to this question, Marion?
Well, I would interpret the term shared by, meaning that everybody agrees on these criteria. And I think I would expect that the best forum for finding that kind of agreement would be a forum that focuses on sustainability questions. So the Paris Agreement or continuations of this would be the forum where that would be well suited to discuss, for instance, environmentally sustainable standards. There is agreement between the WTO and the ILO that the ILO is the place to discuss sustainability standards, and at the OECD we work with the ILO and also with the environmental community when we set our OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. then how to link these criteria to the trade rules, to the WTO, this then implies a collaboration between these different forums, between these different platforms, and a cross-reference between these platforms, between their legal instruments. But the way of finding this agreement, it could be done at the WTO, but maybe that's not the best place. Let me end by saying that one of the formidable advantages of an institution like the OECD is that topics like sustainability, like environmental aspects of trade, are discussed in our organization by an environmental directorate, a trade directorate, a directorate is analyzing finance, and a directorate analyzing economics. So we get a very holistic view of how different ministries within a country would look at this aspect. The Minister Riester made several times reference to the need of different ministries to collaborate. That's something we consider important, and that's something our platform at the OECD allows members to do among members and across ministries.
Cannot hear you. Pascal, if you're asking me a question, I cannot hear you. So my apologies, but I cannot hear you. And so we're trying to
No,
fix it.
that's my fault. It's
I
my
can hear
fault,
you now.
Dutchman.
I can hear
Yeah,
you now, Pascal. Yes.
that's my fault. Apologies. I had got my mic for 1 second. The question I can see on my chat box is about the free circulation of people, saying COVID has obviously led to a huge restriction of free circulation of people. What is the business view about this? Is this the way to go in order to address this crisis, and at which economic cost?
When you say recirculation, you mean people traveling between countries? Is that what you mean? Or going to work in the office? Is that what you mean?
That's the question seems to be directed to border restrictions.
Oh, well, I think, there's no question that it has been challenging to operate in a world where, you can't travel and do business in various parts of the world. There's no question that is challenging. Now, we have learned with technology to offset at least some of that. I know things that we are doing with technology to go to markets, to interact with our local teams, to interact with our local partners, with our suppliers. We have really used technology in new ways, and it's changing the way we work. So we've tried to compensate a lot of that. I do, however, think that there are parts of what we do which require collaboration, that require people sitting across, brainstorming, doing things together. And there's no question people miss the social interaction of dealing with other people in person. There's no question there is a cost to doing this. My hope is that over time we find a happy balance, a balance that continues to leverage these technology tools and brings it to bear, but at the same time also facilitates collaboration, facilitates conversation and interactions in person. And my sense is that over time, business will find that happy medium.
Thanks very much. We are nearing the conclusion of this debate because of the time we've been allotted. Let me try and take a few bits of what has been said, which I think started, and there's agreement on this screen, which means around this table, on the fact that we need to make sure that we can increase trust in the trading system. That's something which you all said, and that COVID has probably made us realize a bit more, that this trust is not just about safety, security, it's also about a larger concept of sustainability, environment, social impact, and conditions of production as they appear through supply chains, and the operational conclusion, and I like this operational conclusion as chair of this Paris Peace Forum, that this will necessitate cooperation. This will necessitate businesses, public institutions, NGOs, who usually are a bit more on the critical side of this system of global supply chains, i.e. globalization. In a nutshell, not a deglobalization, but a globalization which will be a bit different, with a bit more regionalization and a bit more attention to the criteria that define the sustainability of these supply chains. Again, an area where a formula like the Paris Peace Forum, which is involving various stakeholders in addressing these big issues which we have in common, is the way to go. And maybe for the next edition of the Paris Peace Forum, some sort of initiative. And I'm hinting at the minister, I'm hinting at Mario, I'm hinting at Laxma, maybe some sort of initiative on how to converge on the metrics of these sustainability of supply chains would be welcome. Thanks very much for your participation. Sorry about the few technical glitches here and there. That's the law of a super large platform in order to interact. Many thanks for your contribution, and back to the studio, the regie, for the rest of the afternoon. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you.